Okay, hi folks. Thanks for joining the webinar tonight. My name is Malcolm MacDonald. I'm chairing this webinar, Introducing. On the line, helping out with questions and generally assisting is Robert Ramsey here from our specialist team. And on the line from Argentina, we've got Allan Cameron here to talk about the Argentinian farming industry. Allan is a Argentinian farmer who can trace his roots back to Scotland quite quickly, a couple of generations back, and he's got a really good overview of the whole country and the farming out there, which he's going to run through with us. Just quickly before we move on, before I hand over to Allan for his presentation, we've got you can ask questions at any time. If you look on the right hand side of the screen, there's a little dashboard where you can just type in your questions and either me or Robert will pick them up to put to Allan later on. So we'll aim to let Allan speak first and then have questions at the end, but if anything comes to you you'd like to ask, just put it in the questions of the chat at any point during the presentation and we can pick it up for later on. So without further ado from me, I think I'll hand over to yourself, Allan. Thank you.
Good day. Good evening all. Saying hello from Argentina. I'll give you a small introduction to who I am and where we come from. Great-great-grandfather came from the west of Scotland in Ardnamurchan. He left when he was 20 years old and went to New Zealand. There he married a girl from Ayrshire, and my great-grandfather was born in New Zealand and he came to Argentina in 1892. Went down to Patagonia, farmed in the very south of Argentina and Chile till 1914, where he then moved north and bought a farm in the province of Buenos Aires, where we are now. My grandfather, my father and I, and my three brothers and a few other cousins, we all went back to school in Scotland. I was there from 1977 to 1981 in Edinburgh at Fettes College, so we've been there. And my brothers and I were very lucky to spend our holidays, or part of them, in Fife with John and Margaret Cameron. So what little farming I know, I learned it mainly from him. So that's as a way of an introduction. And the idea this evening is to give you a bit of a view of Argentina as a food exporter, what we produce, how we do it, and where it goes. So that's what the talk is going to be about. Just here a map of the world to show you where Argentina is in regard to Europe and the States and China. We're very far away, but also to point out that the size of Argentina. Argentina is 11 times the size of the UK, with a varied landscape. We've got the Andes all the way down our backbone on the left, where we border with Chile, and we're about 1,000 kilometers wide and 5,000 kilometers from north to south, and 1,000 kilometers at its widest. In Patagonia, we're not so wide. Our rainfall goes from the east to the west. We have probably 40 inches on the east side in the north, and we go through a very arid patch before we get to the Andes on the left, where there's very, very low rainfall. But that's where we are worldwide. This map shows a bit of the effect of the rainfall. The green on the east side is a higher rainfall, and on the west and Patagonia, very low rainfall, and therefore much lower grass production, much harder climate, and therefore what you can do on those farms is very different to what you can do on the eastern side. So Argentina, with its neighboring countries of Uruguay, Brazil, Paraguay in the north, Bolivia and Chile on the west, we have a population of 44 million people, and 70% at least of those of our inhabitants live in cities that are above 3 million people. So it's a very high concentration of urban dwellers, and really as you go through the countryside, it's very sparsely populated, especially as you go west and north into the harder climates. Very few people really, and very few people living on the land. When we talk about cattle, we have 54 million head of cattle. It's around that number most of the time. Sometimes we drop a bit when the business gets bad, and sometimes we go a bit above that number when people hold on to their females and the stocks go up. So that's what happens in the cattle, and we'll talk about how we produce it and what we export. Regarding cereals and oilseeds, in the last 40 years, we've gone from 40 million tons to 140 million tons. There's been a very marked increase in what we produce. Our star oilseed is soybean, which we crush a lot of it here. Only a small proportion goes as seed to be crushed overseas, but a lot of it is crushed in this country, and we send soybean meal overseas and soybean oil, and that's the way it goes out. What I was talking about, our productive area, high rainfall area, we have 1,000 kilometers north-south and 600 kilometers east-west of an area of above 25 inches of rainfall, and that makes it very productive land. And apart from the States, which has its corn belt, there are not many other areas in the world of this size that are so suited to production of crops and rearing of animals, therefore making Argentina an important exporter of food to the rest of the world. A little bit about our cattle production. Argentina's breeding herds are extensive breeding herds mainly. One big advantage is our climate. We don't have to have any of our stock indoors at any time of the year at all. In some areas, the limitation would be high temperatures, and in other areas, the winters are cold and harsh, but our cattle are always all outdoors. Argentina was traditionally British breeds, Aberdeen Angus being the most widespread, followed by Herefords and Shorthorns. But what's happened in the last, let's say 40 years, is that cattle breeding has been pushed out by continuous agriculture to harsher areas where you can't do agriculture. That's where the cows have been. And in our case, it's meant that cattle have gone further north to tropical areas, and that's why we now have a higher proportion of Braford and Brangus, which is a Brahman cross on the Angus or a Brahman cross on the Hereford. So these breeds, we have a higher proportion of these breeds in our cattle numbers. They're hardier animals that will put up with the higher temperatures and harder conditions, but in the tropical areas. There's a small proportion of European breeds, for example, Limousin and Charolais, but more in the wetter areas, where it's not so harsh, and therefore we have a bit of influx of them. producing a bigger animal and a leaner animal. But that's the way our herd's made up. So when we talk about the British breeds, they'd be in what we call the Pampas, which is mainly the province of Buenos Aires and a bit further north and a bit further west. Extensive breeding, extensive cattle farming. Here we reckon a breeding farm is efficient if for every employee that's involved in the cattle section, we can have 500 cows. So if we have 500 cows per employee, we're being pretty efficient of how we are running the breeding herds. In this part of the country, you'll find that our reproductive indices are high. We above 90% pregnancy and good results. When you go further north into the harder country, here's an example of our Braford cows. It'll be a Zebu bull on a Hereford cow, and it can either have a 3/8 content of Bos indicus or a 5/8 Bos indicus, and this will be a larger animal, killing out at probably 600 kilos instead of 450, which is what the British breeds kill out at down here. This in our British breeds, we are bulling at 15 months or maybe at 18 months, whereas in the Bos indicus crosses, we are bulling at 2 years or above 2 years before they get the bull. So a bit different there, but these crosses of Braford are longer lived. They'll probably do 12 or 15 years, and they're still producing. And this is the sort of quality of Braford. When it's grain fed, it also finishes off very well, high quality. This will be up in the north of the country. The Pampas area, this area of 1,000 kilometers by 600 kilometers, naturally didn't have any trees on it. It was all very flat ground. So when you see these native trees in the hills, this will be in the northwest of the country, where now we are having interesting beef production. We really run cattle wherever we can. I'd say in the first place, we do agriculture wherever we can. And if we can't do agriculture because of the quality of soil or because of the rainfall, then we'll have cattle. So we've also got cattle down in Patagonia, even though there are small numbers. But as we're very keen beef consumers, you'll find that there's cattle just about everywhere. This is very good quality also in Patagonia and mainly Herefords. They're well suited to that climate. And this will be a winter scene down in Patagonia, more like Scotland, but it's really a very small proportion of the Argentine herd that is under these conditions. When we come back to the Pampas, we've got a number of setups that are very intensive. In some cases, actually, some people compete with intensive beef production. They're competing against agriculture because normally agriculture is a more profitable business. But some people with these intensive systems of rotation get very high productions of kilograms of beef per hectare. So there'll be mainly the rearing stage after the animal is weaned. He'll be on a rotation of grass, and then there's a high percentage. I'd probably say about 70 or 80% of the beef that is finished off in Argentina today is grain fed. today with silage and other grains in the ration. There's a small proportion of grass-fed animals that are identified as such and supply certain markets that don't pay too much of a premium yet, but we think it's something that's going to evolve, and there'll be a better price if you can show that your cattle have been always on grass. But today, even our local consumers that we thought would always go for the grass-fed, they've got used to the beef being presented with a whiter. The fat content is whiter, and the taste. The population hasn't veered away from it. So a high proportion of grain-fed animals, and we have an abattoir industry that is well prepared these days for exporting to different markets. We have a Hilton cut that goes to Europe. A very small proportion of our beef makes the Hilton cut, even though it's the highest price we get paid for that sort of beef, but it's a very small amount. Here's another view of these rather large setups, very mechanized, very efficient. Probably not so good on the conditions the animals have to be in, but most of them have shade and look after those aspects. We have the selling of our cattle is rather unique. We have this big cattle market in Liniers. Some of you, the ones who have been here, will remember that it's well within the city. 120 years ago, or 130, I think it is now. It started out on the outskirts of the city, but today it's only a 15-minute drive from the center of town, and you're at this market. This market operates these days 3 days a week because of COVID. We used to operate 4, so it's down to 3 days a week. And they'll be shutting in about 10,000 head of cattle a day. In the next 2 years, this market will move to the outskirts of the city, and this area will surely be built up with housing and stuff. But there's a bit of tradition, and here I'll just show you a short little video of how this cattle market works. So apart from beef, which is our main production of animal meats, we've also got sheep. Back in the 1920s, we used to have a very large number of sheep when what moved part of the world economy was the wool trade. But these days, numbers of sheep are low, but there is still an amount of fat lamb produced. Very strangely, we consume very little mutton in Argentina, but I think that's mainly because beef is relatively cheap. But if you do go down to Patagonia, you'll see these sort of scenes. And as most livestock in this country, people work it on horseback, and these are the sort of typical scenes. The sheep are a dual-purpose sheep. There is a certain amount of merinos, but a very large number of corridales, which produce a decent fat lamb. Our poultry industry is growing rapidly along the lines of, our pig industry, along the lines of how pigs are done worldwide these days, all indoors and all automatically fed. And these animals are slaughtered at between 105 and 125 kilograms, and it's an industry that's growing. We've also got a very important poultry industry that has also grown and is also exporting. So it's fairly dynamic. If you're a poultry farmer, you're very dependent on the price of corn, and as we export corn is worth US dollars a ton. So sometimes you're caught with high costs of production and a lower cost of what you can sell. But so that's why sometimes beef farming, which is has a lower cost if you're doing it grass-fed, doesn't have so much of a risk as the other intensive industries. Up in the west against the Andes, there's also a high, I think we've got about 3 million goats, and I just saw the other day that we're exporting goat meat to certain parts of the world, so it's something where we've also got an important potential. I drew this up, information from 2019, so it's up to date, and this shows where Argentina's exports of beef go to. As you can see, 60% of it is sucked up by China. They take most of the cow trade, and the cheaper cuts go to China, but that's what they prefer, that's what they want. So they take 61% of the total, but as you can see, they take the cheaper cuts at $4,800 a ton, whereas the EU takes 7%, but very much a higher price at $67,000 a ton, if that figure is right. That'll be the Hilton cut. That's what they're taking. US has a very small share, but it's a market that we're working on. It'll be hamburger beef that goes to the States, and as you can see, it's a very small amount of our production that goes to the UK. It'll be again very high quality cuts, the Hilton cut. So this was just to point out that where our beef goes and how little of it actually goes to the UK. We are much more interested in selling our soybean meal and our corn to Europe, so that you can still keep fattening some of the animals that you breed. So that's a bit of a roundup of the beef industry and how we do it and where it goes. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about this when we do our questions. Agriculture, as I said, is really more important as regards amount of dollars in our export. We are producing 140,000 tons. And another thing is that Argentina, because we produce 140,000 million tons and there's 44 million of us, somebody worked out that actually we produce enough food to feed 10 times our population. It's probably strictly not as linear as that, because a lot of what we produce goes as soybean meal, sunflower meal, corn, sorghum, and other grains that actually go to other countries and are fed to animals in those other countries. For example, the pigs in China and poultry and such like, and the same as the UK. The soybean meal that goes to the UK will be mainly going to to feed stock. But we do have this incredible potential for producing agricultural products due to the soil we have, the extension of it, the rainfall, and the sunlight. So it's a privileged part of the world to be in if what you enjoy is production. This is a bit to show what we produce, the importance of soybean and sunflower, and corn being the second most important product we export. There again, it goes to feed stock in other parts of the world. They can also make oil out of corn. And wheat, we are back again, an important wheat exporter. We've had political influence in which some years ago our production of wheat barely covered what we were consuming ourselves. But now we're back in the right direction as regarding wheat, and we also do a fair amount of barley. We can produce good malting barley in certain parts of the country, and that's exported. And then in the north of the country, rice production is important. So all that goes on. Another important thing that has changed in the last 30 years is that we do a very high percentage of no-till farming. 95% of the agriculture in Argentina has gone from the late 80s, beginning 1990s, into no-till farming. That basically means it's much more sustainable. When we used to till our soil, we could only till our soil for 5 or 6 years cropping. We had to go back to 4 or 5 years of grass to regain our soil structure. Erosion through wind and rain put a limit to the number of years we could do agriculture. So with no-till farming, the biggest advantage we've found is cutting down on erosion and make it sustainable. One thing, we go one step further, and anything that has a winter crop in our agricultural area, about 90% of it goes into a summer crop straight away. So the winter cereals will be planted at the beginning of our winter. There'll never be any snow on it, but we'll be harvesting it at the end of the spring, November, beginning of summer, December, and we'll be planting a double crop of soybean, or in some cases corn or sorghum, and that increases our production per hectare and makes it very efficient. Something that's also changed in the last 20 years is on-farm storage. As I told you, we went from 40 million tons to 140 million tons in a short number of years, and we certainly didn't have the infrastructure to store the grain and be able to feed it to the ports at the right sort of amount that could be shipped. So when this form of temporary storage came up with these plastic bags, it means we can harvest in areas where sometimes the roads were a problem. Some areas before you couldn't do agriculture because the roads were earth roads, and if it rained, you couldn't get your grain out at harvest time and such. But these bags has increased, is the second reason why our production has increased so much in the last 40 years. The first reason will have been no-till farming and Roundup Ready soybean, and the second reason will be this on-farm storage that allows us to hold the grain for as many months as we like between one harvest and the rest, and take it to the port or to the factories, to the crushing plants as they need it, rather than trying to get it all to them at harvest time. So regarding the exports of our production, there are four main ports. The most north, which says Rosario, is actually 300 kilometers upriver from the Atlantic. So the ships go 300 kilometers winding up the Paraná River, and that's where the big soybean crushing plants are, and also a lot of the corn and the wheat goes from Rosario. Buenos Aires was traditionally the biggest port, but today specializes in containers rather than bulk grain. And then further south on the Atlantic, the one that's further west, which is Bahia Blanca, is the bigger of the two ports in the south, and it does a lot of grain, not so much processed, but bulk corn or soybean seed or wheat. And the other port, Quequén, is actually only 25 miles from where we farm, a very convenient port, and you'll see some pictures of it at the end of this presentation. A lot of the production from the north of the country will come down the Paraná River to Rosario in these barges, similar to what happens on the Mississippi River. And some of Brazil's production, Paraguay's production, and Bolivia's production also comes down to the crushing plants in Rosario, or to be put on ships and sent out to the world. So the waterways are an important form of transport. Most of the rest of our transport is done by road, by trucks, a very high percentage. And at harvest time, these sort of scenes are quite familiar. We have got better at managing logistics, and these trucks will know that they'll get to the port and usually unload in the day, at least in the 24 hours from when they arrive. They'll be heading back home. 20, 30 years ago, some of the trucks probably used to sit 2 or 3 days at the port before they could go back home. Rail, Argentina had a very important railway system developed by the British at the turn of the century, 100 years ago. And then it was taken over by the state in the late 40s, 1950s. And since then, it just went downhill. Our rail system is very poor these days, and it's where we need to improve to be able to move our grain cheaply from areas that are more than 1,000 kilometers away from the port. The way to get this to the port is the cheapest way is by rail, no doubt. So this is a bit of a summary. Really, what Argentina needs to improve on is its lack of infrastructure. These days, our politics make it very difficult for foreign investors to come and bring money into the country. But when our politicians do things right, we do have some periods of time when this investment does come in, and we're really looking at improving our railways and ports to make it more efficient. We'll always be prisoners of our politicians. They decide which way we go. The farming community is a small proportion of Argentina's population. We have a high proportion of our youth are below the poverty line, don't receive the sort of education we should be giving them, and it's probably the biggest setback we have and the biggest challenge we have, even though we do have this great country from nature's point of view, with big extensive land to be able to farm. But we need to get organized as a society be able to express our full potential. We can produce properly, we can produce for what the markets are asking for with traceability and such. But we've really got to get organized within our boundaries in order to maximize the potential we have. Well, I think that rounds up what I had to say, and we'll pass it on to Malcolm and Robert and see how they carry on from here.
Okay, thank you, Alan. That was yeah, very interesting, and some great pictures as well to back up what you're saying. Robert, I think we've got a few questions coming in, but I'll just pop back to my screen so you can see how to put in any more questions as well.
Okay, so first of all, I would just like to thank Alan. It's actually a wee bit of a favour to me, I suppose. So Alan was kind enough to host us on a team of us on a young farmer study tour in, I think it was 2014, and we had a terrific fortnight in Argentina and get a really good insight into what was on the go over there. And really, the purpose of this 1 hour webinar was to try and get a tiny bit of that across to people, and I think you've done a really good job there, Alan. It's been really useful. But we have got some good questions coming through, and there's plenty of room for more. So if you do have any other questions out there, just fire them on. But to start with, let's go with for in the cattle system here, traceability is a huge issue, and obviously double tagging. We're now heading into electronic tagging and full traceability for our cattle system. How does it work in Argentina for traceability, and also when it comes to things like health records? Can you use growth hormones and antibiotics? It's quite a long one.
I'll start with that one. We do use antibiotics when necessary, but very small amounts. We don't use growth hormones anymore. We used to probably 30 years ago, but when the markets put some restrictions in, they're not used anymore. Regarding traceability, traceability is in, it's working, and it's a requirement for the export trade, not so for the internal market. But you'll find that most farms we're tagging, as you say, with a double tagging system. But as so much of our beef goes to the internal market, the system is there, and what goes for export is traceable, and what goes to the internal market, it's not being required.
Okay, excellent, thanks. Another question here is, so in Scotland, finding labour for stock farms is really difficult, and justifying the minimum wage for a worker is really hard on a stock farm. Roughly, what would the hourly rate be for a cattle worker on an Argentinian farm?
Okay, so what we talk about is monthly wages, and a worker who's on just a cattle farm, he'll have the perk that he'll be housed, and in most cases he'll be fed. He's probably also given his clothing. His working clothing is also part of the arrangement. And today they'd be 30,000 pesos, which would probably be $400 a month. Now, you'll remember, Robert, the difference between the official exchange rate at which we import our fertilizer and we export our beef, which is today at 80 pesos to the dollar. But if you come with a US dollar or a pound in your pocket, you get double the amount of pesos if you change that on the street. But really, commerce works on the official rate, and that's why I'd say $400 a month, $500 a month is what a farm labor is getting. But to take it to practical terms, if somebody works on a cattle farm, I can refer to the ones we administrate some cattle farms for other people. So they live on the farm, and they'll get, their children would get public education, which is free, and you'll see most of them in a 20-year-old motor car, which probably 30 years ago was you didn't. I mean, they didn't do so well. But that's basically how they get along.
Yeah, excellent. And I think from memory, the exchange rate, whether it's official or unofficial, is vastly different to what it was when we were across the sea. There must have been some serious inflation anyway.
Well, when you were here, it was 8 pesos to the dollar. Today it's 80.
Yeah.
So we've gone 10 times. In 7 years, we've devalued 10 times. And it's all due to government spending. Our government can't reduce its spending to what its income is. We're always borrowing and overspending, and now when we can't borrow, we print. So you know, that's why we get such high devaluations in such a short period of time.
Yeah, that was actually a seamless link on government spending onto subsidy. So a few people have asked how the subsidy system works in Argentina.
The subsidy system works exactly the other way around that it does in Europe. The farming sector pays subsidies to the government, and therefore a lot of government spending is done through heavy taxing of the farming sector. We have what you call export tax, and soybean and sunflower today are paying 30% export tax. Corn and wheat are, I think, about 15. Beef is probably about 10. Dairy products also about 10. So there's never, farming sector never gets subsidized by government or by the urban sector. It's always the other way around. We look at Europe and understand why government or the people, city dwellers, have to subsidize farming, because if not, it wouldn't be viable, and all your farms would be empty. But here it's the other way around. We feel the farming sector is a dairy cow that is milked daily, and for the rest of society to be able to carry on.
Yeah, excellent. Now we hear quite a lot about what's happening in Brazil and felling the Amazon rainforest and planting soya, and you know, the obviously major issues with that. The land that Argentina's growing soya on, is that the same? Was it rainforest? Was it grassland before, or what kind of made up that type of ground?
No, there has been a proportion in the last 20 or 30 years that has been cleared. Some land that was had very low production of stock, mainly cattle. Those lands with a high agricultural potential, especially in the north of the country, land has been cleared for agriculture. But you'll find that this large expansion of land called the Pampas didn't have any trees on it at all. So the main part of Argentina's soybean and wheat and corn comes from land that never had any trees on it, though there is a certain amount that today has been cleared. I think Brazil has a different proportion. A much higher proportion of the land that is planted with soybean today was rainforest. But it's basically supply and demand. If the demand for soybean drops because the world doesn't need so much, the price will drop, and it won't be viable to produce those crops inland in Brazil, so far from the the sea, and it won't be economically viable to clear land. So it's a tricky issue as to here in Argentina in the last 10 years there has been legislation indicating what land can be cleared and what land will never be cleared. So there's not an unlimited clearing of land. It's now been there's been a break put on it, and I think there'll be areas that'll never be cleared. Maybe those areas should be turned into national parks, and wildlife would be taken care of probably more professionally. But yes, I think Brazil has a bigger issue because they have more land which has agricultural potential, and the world somehow is still hungry for what South America produces.
Yeah, it's worrying times, I suppose. The one thing, we can't go through a day farming in Scotland without hearing about climate change and about methane emissions and our responsibility to reduce emissions from our businesses. What's the situation? Is there a drive in South America to reduce emissions, or are we not there yet?
It is a topic of conversation, but it is still very much a debate of whether beef production holds more carbon into the soil and into the plants than the methane emission of the cattle. I think it's not something that's being legislated on. We're not having any reduction of cattle numbers because of that. And really, if you ask your average citizen in the Argentine, I don't think he'd be too up to date in what you're talking about. It's not an issue today.
Yeah, it's again a worry. It's obviously a global issue, and we're working hard, and other countries in Europe working hard, and it'll be interesting to see where that discussion goes down the line. The next one, a good question came in actually, which is about China. So obviously it's you're exporting, you're pumping a lot of stuff into China. Has there been much evidence of Chinese companies coming to buy land in Argentina?
No, not very much. Not the way they've bought up so much of Australia, for example. We have a Chinese community in small business that have been here for a long time, many decades. A lot of the small supermarkets have been Chinese owned and Chinese worked for some time. China, rather than buying land, has been buying up the big export companies. COFCO has moved in, but it's not so much the land, but it's the business that handles the grain, the exporters, the crushing plants. We see them investing more there than in the land. They are after the product and making sure their supply chain is always working, but not so much on the land.
Yep. Next question. I've had a few questions on dairying. So we've heard a lot about beef and a lot about agriculture or arable farming. What does the dairy sector look like in Argentina?
The dairy sector, we're very suited. We're very well suited to producing milk with dairy cows. Our herd is mainly Friesian. We have a small number of Jersey cattle and Jersey cross. We're very efficient. We've got very good production of grass, and therefore our dairies work all year round, not like in some of the New Zealand ones that stop for a couple of months. So we've got the potential. we've got an important internal market. We consume a lot of our products, and we export when the market requires it. When the market is, when our other competitors are down on their production, or the world market increases its demand, well, there we are. But if you look at this recent history, there are a very large number of dairies that have closed. The smaller dairies, the less efficient ones, have closed down. Agriculture has been more interesting than dairying, but you do have certain amount of industrial dairies being set up with animals being sort of shed fed, probably under a roof rather than a closed shed, but certainly under a shade, and the feed is brought to them, and you're probably talking about dairies that have 3,000 cows milked 3 times a day, and in some cases by a robot rather than a human being. So it's an industry that has a lot of potential, but it's not growing, I'd say. It's the land under dairying is either stable or dropping.
Interesting. You mentioned as well, farmers are obviously a very small proportion of the electorate, so you've got a very small voice, or a very quiet voice. Is there a equivalent of the National Farmers Union, or a group that get together to voice concerns?
Well, it's a very good question. We've got 4 unions rather than 1. So it's very easy for the government to try and split us up a lot of the time. Those 4 unions really differ in their members, in which one of them is probably the big landowners, another one is the members of the cooperatives, another one is the medium farmers, and another one is the very small farmers, or farmers who share farm or work on other people's land. So the 4 unions would have different objectives. When we have had instances like in 2008, when the whole of the farming sector got together and stood against the government that were trying to increase retentions dramatically, and there the farming sector was able to stick together and beat the government on that one. But as you say, as an electorate force, we're very small, and really we're governed by people who live in the cities.
Yeah, interesting. Again, one question, I think you've already probably clarified this, but in your opinion, is Argentina gearing up to swamp Britain with a whole load of stuff post-Brexit?
No, it's not something that's talked about here. And as you can see from where our exports go, we've always over the years what we call suffered the fact that the British government and politicians have always made sure that there are certain barriers and tariffs that make it very hard for us to put our product at a competitive price within the UK. My feeling is that whoever's in charge over there will always make sure there's some reason to keep us at arm's length, and the UK I think will take what suits them. I mean, they'll take a Hilton cut because it probably suits them, but it's a small amount. It's a high price item. We're looking, our volumes are very much bigger than what the Scottish market can take. I'd say beef-wise, we're looking at China, that's grown enormously, and we are probably our second market. We'd be aiming at getting beef into the United States. It's a much bigger market.
Yeah, so that's very reassuring, if nothing else. There's a growing population out there, and we're just a small fish in a very big pond. So if you can tell all your Argentine colleagues as well that we don't want it, you can you can keep it.
Well, I think what you should do is the Scottish people should come out here and taste it themselves, and have a look at the country, and then go
Well,
back.
we had was it 17 steaks in 9 days, which I don't think was very good for health, but it was very good steak. And I have to say I certainly didn't have a single bad steak. You know, it was all top quality stuff and really well processed and cooked.
One thing you'll notice is that we kill our animals at a much well, probably not so much younger than yours, but very much lighter. Our British breeds go out at 450 or kilos a head, or in some cases as light as 380 kilos. And we're used to eating very tender beef.
Yeah, and at the moment we're busy trying to get people to produce a carcass that's less than 400 kilos. You know, it's a totally different setup.
Yes, so different that all our breeding cows, they all calve outdoors and unassisted. If we have to assist a cow at calving, in most cases she's culled. We don't have enough time to be calving our cows. So it's a different system from the very beginning. And those Aberdeen Angus cows that have to go through our winters on low quality forage, you don't want a big cow, because then you'll have to feed her during the winter. And we're looking at not feeding cows at all, and not having to assist them at calving. So that's probably also a reason why our animals are a bit smaller.
Yeah, super efficient. Just a final question is to do with, there's a few questions about GM and you know, how sustainable that is. You know, are there issues with Roundup resistance and crop issues to do with using too much Roundup? And also, is there a drive to put cattle back into arable rotations to keep organic matter levels up and improve soil fertility?
Well, I'll start with that one. There isn't a move. We haven't lost too much organic matter with no-till farming, because remember that all our crop residues lie on the ground and decompose and go into the soil. What we are doing a bit of these days is putting a few cover crops in the rotation, which we can graze. So we'll probably harvest a winter cereal the beginning of the summer, and rather than put in a summer crop that'll be too late, we'll put in a cover crop in the beginning of the autumn and graze cattle on it through the winter until the spring, and then it'll go back into a summer crop with no tillage. So we are getting a few cattle back onto agricultural farms, but we don't see any reason for farms that are 100% no-till farming for 25 years. We don't see any reason for having to put stock back on them. We can still, our yields have actually, because of genetics, the latest increase in yield has been through genetics in our varieties of what we plant. And regarding GM, we got in with GM soybean back in 1994. There is hardly any resistance to GM products locally, and we find that countries that really need our production are prepared to take soybean, whether it's GM or not. We do have a very recent discovery of a wheat variety that is resistant to drought. It's been developed by an Argentine company, and it's GM. But in fact, we won't be able to produce that until our main wheat market, which is Brazil, accepts wheat that is GM, and we see it highly unlikely that the consumers will want to have flour that is GM. We feel that until GM ensures a better product to the consumer will always choose something that is not GM. But regarding corn and soybean, which are the species that have most GM content, of course, it's going for animal feed. So we're feeding pigs and chickens, which then humans consume. But that way, GM isn't so questioned.
Yep. One final question, and then I'm done. We've run it slightly over time, but there's loads of questions have come in, and apologies to those who won't get their question answered. What we might do is try and get some of these to Alan or get some answers to you, because there's a lot of questions have come in. What would you say generally is the perception of Scottish farming or British farming in Argentina?
There is a certain segment of Argentine farmers who have enough scale in the production that allows them to travel the world. They enjoy going to Scotland, but they'll go to Scotland because of the whiskey and the sights and the pipe bands, and we consider Scottish farming. We have great respect for Scottish farming, especially in the cattle world, because that's where our breeds come from. And not so long ago, our genetics, we used to buy bulls in the Perth show, and a lot of our bloodlines are Scottish. We consider that we have great respect for the Scottish farmers regarding how you produce under much harsher conditions than we do, climate-wise, and so we don't consider Scottish farmers a threat to our markets. We are very happy to be able to send some of our agricultural products, mainly soybean meal and corn, that way. But yes, there's a lot of respect and a lot of history, and there's a fair amount of Scottish genetics in the farming sector as regarding the human beings as well.
Good. So a pat in the back to us all. At this stage, Alan, I would just want to pass on my thanks for coming along today, or for getting involved with this. It's been really good. Apologies to those who haven't got your questions answered, but we'll see what we can do with that. And with that, I'll just hand you back to Malcolm.
Okay,
thank you very much.
Robert. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Alan. It's a fantastic insight into how you farm over there. So that's really very interesting. And thank you, everybody else, for attending and for keeping a great flow of questions coming through. It really adds to it as well. So thank you for that. A couple of quick things for me to mention. First of all, will be feedback forms. You should get an email tomorrow at some point, I think, with a feedback form. This meeting is Farm Advisory Service funded, so it's really important to us to get a bit of feedback and find out what you liked or didn't like, so we can keep things going for the next ones. I'd also like to mention next week we've got another webinar on Monday night again. It's with Doug Avery, who you're probably mostly aware of, who did a tour last year. So it'll be a fantastic opportunity to get to hear him speak from the comfort of your own home as well. So that's great. And one final thing too, this webinar has been recorded, so if you want to watch it again or just caught it halfway through, if you look on the FAS website, you should see it within a week or 10 days or so. But I think that's all the housekeeping from me. So once again, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Alan, for your presentation and your time with the questions. Really great to have you speaking here. And thank you, Robert, for your help on the questions too. And that's it. Thank you all. Have a good night.